Hi. In this video, we'll be covering two main topics. First, what the word indigenous actually means when referring to groups of people. And second, how Israel supporters misappropriate this concept to frame Israelis as indigenous people, and why some of the common arguments they make to this end are invalid. So yeah, let's get right down to it. In recent times, pro-Israel propaganda has been trying to integrate more and more popular social causes. For example, with the rapid acceptance of LGBT rights and the rising popularity of veganism throughout much of the First World during the last 2 decades, its defenders, lobbyists, and government have suddenly started to try and portray Israel as a bastion of gay rights, despite gay marriage being illegal there, and also as some sort of vegan paradise. Such campaigns further a relatively new Israeli propaganda line that Israel is a paradise of social progress, with the aim to distract from the fact that the country was founded via a mass ethnic cleansing of Palestinians just 70 years ago, and that it still today exercises mass violence and oppression against those same Palestinians every second of every day. Imagine an ad for apartheid South Africa with 2 gay people smiling while they eat vegetables, with the tagline, "Not so racist and repressive now, are we?" It's the same thing. It's designed to manipulate the emotions of casual observers who might not think to ask, and just how exactly does this do anything to negate your ethnic cleansing and occupation of Palestine? Indigenous issues have also gained a lot of currency worldwide over the last 3 or 4 decades. People are more and more conscious of colonialism and the struggles of indigenous peoples than ever before, a fact emphasized by the UN passing its Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People back in 2007, showing just how mainstream the discussion has become. Of course, this is just a start, as there's still an incredibly long way to go, and there's no shortage of dishonest attempts to co-opt indigenous struggles, like how Israel supporters have. Relentless in their attempts to appropriate just about any issue for propaganda purposes, pro-Israel propagandists have taken note of the currency that indigenous issues now have. Hence, some of them have started painting the dominant Israeli Jewish population as indigenous, with the aim of convincing others that Israel is not actually a state formed largely by migrants with no connection to Palestine, who moved there en masse and ethnically cleansed most of those who were there beforehand, but rather simply the legitimate indigenous people retaking their rightful territory. You might have seen some of this rhetoric before, as it's becoming more and more common. There's dozens of articles making this claim, take your pick. And probably the most illustrative example of the extreme end is this bizarre pro-Israel organization clothing brand called Decolonized Judean. This organization tries very explicitly to take advantage of sympathy for indigenous people among social progressives by appropriating the terminology of indigenous liberation. They frame most Israelis not as relatively recent arrivals, but actually as ancient people from the Kingdom of Judea from thousands of years ago, who have simply returned to decolonize Judea. Thanks to this magic, Israel is not a colonial project, but actually the complete opposite. So if a Jewish guy from New York who's never been to the Middle East moves to Israel straight into a Palestinian house gifted to him by the Israeli state after its owners were expelled by one of the world's most powerful militaries, he's not actually stealing someone else's house and invading other people's land. Rather, he's an oppressed indigenous man decolonizing.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is gonna steal it.
No.
Nice one, Braden. You're definitely just like a Native American dude. It's appropriating the rhetoric of indigenous empowerment and decolonization to attempt to legitimize Israel's current colonialism, a particularly unsubtle attempt to completely invert the reality of the situation. That's exactly the sort of narrative that we're going to be dissecting in this video. The most immediate problem for this sudden trend among Israel supporters is that, back in the day, colonialism wasn't a dirty word like it tends to be today. Europeans in particular were very enthusiastic about it and openly espoused it as a good thing, rightfully undertaken by the strong for their own benefit. The concept of indigenous people was uncommon, and in the limited circumstances where it was used, it didn't imply anything about a right to the land. Rather, it carried a negative connotation and was used to denote people who were considered to be of a lower class. class, like in France's colonies in Africa, for example. So when Zionism, a political movement to move as many people considered to be Jewish as possible to Palestine and create an ethnic supremacist state there, started gaining steam in the late 19th century, its mostly European adherents didn't mince words. Greatly inspired by the practices and thought of other Europeans of the day, they were a lot more open about the nature of what they were doing than today's Zionists tend to be. They stated often that what they were doing was colonialism, thus making it clear that they were the colonizers, certainly not the colonized and certainly not indigenous. Theodor Herzl was the founder of the Zionist colonial movement and its first elected president. He's so significant in the history of Zionism that he's often called the father of Zionism, and he is considered to be by far the most representative individual of the Zionist movement. His birthday is an Israeli national holiday, and Mount Herzl is the name of the country's most important cemetery where its national heroes are buried, including Herzl himself. In his 1896 pamphlet, The Jewish State, he outlined his plan for the colonization of Palestine. It would be carried out in the by then long-established English manner, through the formation of a chartered company incorporated in Britain, which would have under its purview what he called colonial tasks. The movement immediately began putting these plans into practice, and the names of some of the organizations that they founded made their nature very clear. For example, the Jewish Colonial Trust, the Jewish Colonization Association, and the Colonization Commission. When it came time to seek out support for this endeavor, the Zionists, of course, didn't try to build networks of solidarity with Native Americans, or colonized Africans, or other indigenous peoples. Rather, they went straight to the colonial powers themselves and said, "Hey, we want to do colonialism, just like you've done to those people. Want to help?" So Herzl sought out meetings with British colonial officials, like the colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain. To him, he described the Zionist idea as an opportunity for the British Empire to become bigger by sponsoring a rich colony, and requested the granting of colonial rights. And Chamberlain responded in the same terms, referring to Herzl's request as one for the right of colonization. He also very tellingly wrote to Cecil Rhodes, the most significant British colonial leader and ideologue in Africa, responsible for the colonization of Rhodesia, Zambia, and much of South Africa, where he killed, displaced, and dominated countless indigenous people. Herzl clearly saw this as something admirable, something which was to be emulated. That's why he asked Rhodes for his blessing for the Zionist colonization of Palestine. You are being invited to help make history. It doesn't involve Africa, but a piece of Asia Minor. Not Englishmen, but Jews. How, then, do I happen to turn to you, since this is an out-of-the-way matter for you? How indeed? Because it is something colonial. Vladimir Jabotinsky, a prominent Zionist paramilitary leader who came a generation after Herzl and who inspired countless others, including multiple future prime ministers of Israel, made this even clearer when he talked about the stark reality of the Zionist project, making reference to lessons learned from previous European colonization endeavors. It is utterly impossible to obtain the voluntary consent of the Palestine Arabs for converting Palestine from an Arab country into a country with a Jewish majority. My readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. I suggest they consider all the precedents with which they are acquainted and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization being carried on with the consent of the native population. There is no such precedent. This is equally true of the Arabs. They feel at least the same instinctive, jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for ancient Mexico, and the Sioux for their rolling prairies. Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. This is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. Elsewhere, he also wrote, "The iron law of every colonizing movement, a law which knows of no exceptions, a law which existed in all times and under all circumstances. If you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must provide a garrison on your behalf, or else give up on your colonization. For without an armed force which will render physically impossible any attempts to destroy or prevent this colonization is impossible. Not difficult, not dangerous, but impossible. Zionism is a colonizing adventure, and therefore it stands or falls by the question of armed force." Pretty clear there, right? As mentioned beforehand, they had no reason to sugarcoat any of this, as Israel and its supporters sometimes do today, because at that time, colonization was seen as a positive thing. To them, being able to colonize meant that you deserved to take the land, and the victims of these conquests simply deserved their fate. The Zionist movement also framed themselves as bringing civilization to lands that were supposedly barbarous, just as other colonists had for centuries. In The Jewish State, Herzl wrote that his proposed colony would be an outpost of the European colonial powers in the Middle East. "We should there form a portion of the rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all of Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence." Interestingly, what Herzl prescribed there back in 1896 is exactly what Israel ended up becoming. Today, it enjoys the unconditional backing of the Western powers, regardless of its everyday atrocities, due to its utility as an outpost of their interests in the region. Herzl also said the same thing in even clearer terms at the First Zionist Congress in 1897. "It is more and more to the interest of the civilized nations, and of civilization in general, that a cultural station be established on the shortest road to Asia. Palestine is this station, and we as Jews are the bearers of culture, who are ready to give our property and our lives to bring about its creation." Taking inspiration from other settler colonial endeavors before them, the Zionists also planned for many decades a massive removal of the pre-existing native population, which was then quickly carried out via the Nakba after Israel was finally founded many decades later. From the beginning, the existence of a prior non-Jewish population in Palestine was seen as a barrier to the desire of a purely Jewish colonial state. The Palestinians were, for the Zionists, a problem that needed a solution, just as, say, Native Americans had been for the USA and Canada. They were not moving to Palestine to live alongside Palestinians in peace. They were doing so with the goal of getting rid of them and taking over. Herzl wrote, "We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it any employment in our country. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." Zionists were always open about the fact that their quest to found the state that eventually became Israel was a colonial endeavour. They not only called it exactly that constantly, but they identified with the other colonialists of their day and used all of the same language and arguments as they did. Only now that colonialism has come to be reassessed as something more negative, while indigenous issues have simultaneously gained more currency, have Israel supporters started framing Israel instead as some sort of endeavour for indigenous rights. And even beyond just the clear opportunism of this argument, it's fundamentally invalid regardless, because it's based on a misunderstanding of what indigenous actually means in regards to colonialism. There are multiple meanings of the word indigenous, and the main problem at play here is that they're often erroneously conflated with one another all at once. There's the commonly understood definition of the term, which just means originating from a place, which can be used for plants, wildlife, or even people. I could say, for example, that modern humans are commonly believed to be indigenous to Africa, because that's where I think we most likely originated from. We could also say that, like, Frankish people were indigenous to France, because that's where the culture originated. But this isn't actually what indigenous means most of the time when referring to people. We tend to use it in a very particular way, but most of us don't really think about why, hence how this confusion can happen. Native North Americans, for example, are called Indigenous people. Aboriginal Australians too. Quechua, Aymara, and the countless other Indigenous groups of the Americas are referred to as such as well. But we don't call, say, French people of 100% pure Frankish ancestry Indigenous. Nor do we call 100% pure Anglo-Saxon Englishmen Indigenous, even though under the most basic definition of originating from a place, they probably qualify. The reason for this is that the term Indigenous people doesn't refer to simply groups of people who originate from a particular place. It is, rather, a status imposed upon groups of people through colonialism. Indigenous peoples are those whose societies have been upended as a result of colonialism, and especially settler colonialism, and whose existence as distinct groups of people with competing claims to the land is seen as an impediment to the new societies built at the expense of theirs. This is very clear both in just how we actually practically apply the term, as I just went over, and in its most prominent definitions, such as the working definition of Indigenous commonly used by the UN. Indigenous communities, peoples, and nations are those which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing on those territories or parts of them. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity as the basis of their continued existence as peoples, in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal system. So, two very key criteria there. 1, pre-colonial continuity, and 2, being a non-dominant sector of society, or another marginalized society entirely. Clearly, being Indigenous is synonymous with presently being under some form of colonization. Another commonly used definition is the International Labour Organizations, which is basically the same. It reads, descent from populations who inhabited the country or geographical region at the time of conquest, colonization, or establishment of present state boundaries. They retain some or all of their own social, economic, cultural, and political institutions, irrespective of their legal status. If this is confusing, let me provide a hypothetical scenario to make it clearer. Imagine that the French decide to invade and colonize England. They want to systematically get rid of everyone there to make space for French settlers, and as a result, try to destroy and supplant English society with the aim of replacing as much of it as possible with their own. So they attack, take over the entire country, and succeed in driving all of the survivors into Newcastle, which they surround and then dub the Newcastle Reservation. The people who were there beforehand would, as a result of this, become indigenous, because now they would be colonized. And this wouldn't be at all limited just to those who claim descent from ancient Britons from thousands of years ago. That would actually be entirely irrelevant, because it is, rather, a status imposed upon everyone who was a part of the society that the French supplanted, and who continues to be a part of it and struggles to maintain it afterwards. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about a 100% Anglo-Saxon Englishman, or an English guy of Pakistani ancestry, or even just a new immigrant who was unlucky enough to arrive just a few days before the invasion began. They'd all be just as indigenous as one another, because they form a part of the society or societies that the colonizers are trying to replace with their own. So people become indigenous as a result of colonialism, not simply due to ancestry, real or imagined. It's a consequence of actions being taken against them, and systems being set up to attack, marginalize, and attempt to destroy their society and benefit a new dominant replacement established by foreigners. Again, think about all the groups of people who are commonly called indigenous today, and you'll quickly see that this is indeed how the term is mostly used. Indigeneity is not some kind of mystical or innate trait. It is a position in relation to colonialism, similar to how a term like working class describes a position in relation to the economy. And just like how working class is a changeable or even abolishable status rather than something innate, it is in fact possible possible for an indigenous group to cease to be indigenous if the colonial relation that imposed the status upon them is dismantled. A good example of this actually happening is Algeria, which used to be a direct French-ruled colony where French settlers lorded over the indigenous population. Once French Algerian society was overthrown and the country was taken over by its indigenous people, they ceased to be indigenous, and today they're no longer referred to as such except in retrospect. Now, think about Palestine. Between Palestinians and Israelis, who is it who is colonized? Who is it who still lives under colonialism today? Is it the Israelis who formed their state from people who'd moved there over the course of many decades, as part of a process that they openly called colonization, who ethnically cleansed as many of the people who were there beforehand as they could, and who still colonize more and more of Palestine every single day, moving people literally called settlers into Palestinian land and homes? Or is it the Palestinians who they've done, and still do, all of this too? It's very clearly the Palestinians, and any other conclusion requires a complete bastardization of what indigenous actually means. The claim is very transparently just a cynical reaction by supporters of Israel. Israelis claim to be indigenous only in response to Palestinians applying that term to themselves and raising awareness of the fact that they are victims of colonialism. It's an attempt to delegitimize the colonial framing of the Palestinian struggle because Israel and its supporters fear the immense explanatory power that it holds for the nature of the Israeli state. The basis of this trick lies in the fact that most people just haven't really thought about what indigenous actually means before. So Israel supporters claim that Israelis are indigenous based on the simplest dictionary definition of the term, arguing that they had a special right to move en masse and invade Palestine, try to destroy Palestinian society, and build a Jewish ethnic supremacist state at its expense because of a claimed lineage from ancient Judeans who lived in the region. But as we just went over, a connection, real or imagined, to a multiple millennia old polity is not the basis of what makes a group of people indigenous, so the very premise of the claim is invalid. And it's even dumber in the cases where they go beyond that and appeal to religion, as if claiming that your God promised you something could ever seriously justify a settler colonial conquest to anyone but the group carrying it out and other such religious kooks. And back in the day, American settlers also constantly claimed that the USA was gifted to them by God to justify their Native American genocides, so the Israelis aren't even particularly original here. I've already definitively dealt with these sorts of arguments by explaining what it actually means to be indigenous and what indigenous claims to sovereignty are actually based on. Indigenous people make claims for land taken from them against the very same societies that took it, and that still marginalize them today as a result. Not simply the idea that they're the same people that lived somewhere 2,000 years ago. It would be ridiculous if some Native Americans migrated to Europe and then 2,000 years in the future, people claiming to be descended from that group said they have a divine right to cross the Atlantic and conquer North America on that basis. That's the actual equivalent to the pro-Israel argument here. It's clearly nothing like real indigenous claims to sovereignty, and it's clearly just totally ridiculous. A sort of argument and standard that no one would ever seriously entertain in any other circumstance. These sorts of arguments are dangerous to entertain on their own ground, since doing so might imply that there can never be some sort of ephemeral, never-ending, genetic claim to land, going back thousands of years, that can somehow legitimize people moving from anywhere in the world to carry out an ethnic conquest there. I'm gonna entertain them anyway though, just to be thorough, because they're so incredibly weak that even when confronted on their own flawed ground, they just don't hold up. First, let's ask whether this sort of argument is ever applied to any other similar situation. That's generally a pretty good indicator of whether such justifications are being thrown out honestly or not. Is this a standard that is consistently applied to other cases, or even applied at all? The answer to both of those questions is a resounding no. Such justifications are really treated as little more than jokes among anyone aside from those who espouse them, such as with the Greek nationalists who unironically want to to invade Turkey and re-establish the Byzantine Empire. And in that case, we're even talking about around 600 years, not multiple thousands. There are more people who laugh at memes about these sort of justifications than there are actual real-life believers in them. That's the sort of company that the Israeli "it was ours 3,000 years ago" argument is in. Idiotic ethno-nationalists taken seriously by no one but themselves. It's not any less ridiculous than when Mussolini claimed to be continuing the Roman Empire. There is no one who honestly believes that thinking you're related to people who lived somewhere thousands of years ago gives you the right to move there, take over, and displace the present inhabitants. It's clearly not a justification that's taken seriously even by its proponents, rather just a haphazard talking point hatched to cause confusion. We can also ask whether this standard is even applied in practice by the Israeli state that it supposedly legitimizes. If not, then it's even clearer that it's just not something that anyone genuinely believes justifies Israeli colonialism. So, do present-day Israeli individuals need to provide the state with any proof that they are actually the descendants from the ancient Judeans whose lineage they claim legitimizes their conquest of Palestine? Is there some 2,000 or 3,000-year-old corpse found in Palestine, which each of them has a proven genetic connection to, which supposedly legitimizes their ethno-state? Most Israelis can, at most, trace their descent from Jewish individuals going back a couple of generations, just like how most of you watching this probably have proof of at least who your parents and grandparents were. But this means nothing in regards to Palestine, since the vast majority of those recent ancestors didn't actually live there before Zionist colonization, nor did the recent ancestors of those ancestors. They certainly have never proven that they're each individually descended from ancient Judeans from thousands of years ago, nor is evidence of anything even remotely of the sort asked of migrants to Israel. In order to be allowed to migrate to Israel and move into a stolen Palestinian house, all the Israeli state requires is that you have documents attesting to a Jewish mother or grandparent. They don't accept anything further back than that. So not only is the ancient ancestry of said mother or grandparent considered to be just totally irrelevant, but their more immediate ancestry is too. They could have absolutely no traceable ancestry from ancient Palestine, or they could have even just converted. It doesn't matter. The question of this supposedly crucially important ancient population, that according to this argument is what legitimizes the existence of Israel today, is not seen as important enough by the actual Israeli state itself to even consider in its laws on who's allowed to move and live there. There is one caveat here that kinda puts a wrench into my argument and proves me completely wrong. The Israeli government does also accept DNA tests as a basis for Jewish migration, and anyone who can prove descent from ancient Judeans in this way is welcomed. Nah, actually I made that up. Israel does not accept ancestry tests as justification for Jewish migration under the so-called law of return. Even if you had a test that somehow proved you were a direct descendant of King fucking Solomon himself, it wouldn't matter. The only time they accept DNA tests is to prove that someone is a direct relative of a presently existing Jewish citizen of Israel, and only in a few limited instances where other documentary proof has been lost, certainly nothing ancient. So if the Israeli state and Israelis themselves aren't even willing to put their money where their mouth is on this one, if they're unwilling to accept or require proof of descent from ancient people of the region as a justification for being allowed to live there at the expense of Palestinians, then certainly no one else should give this idea any credence. Third, if we for some reason do decide to take a look at genetic studies, this justification also falls over flat very quickly anyway. Before doing this, however, I want to emphasize again that this has absolutely nothing to do with whether people are indigenous or not by itself, and nothing to do with actual indigenous claims to sovereignty. No one is indigenous on the basis that they are related to people who lived somewhere 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. I'm solely mentioning this just because it's kind of funny how many different ways there are to dismantle these idiotic arguments. That they don't even hold up when approached with their own logic is a testament to just how bad they are. Multiple genetic studies have shown that many Jews and Palestinians share ancestry from the same Middle Eastern populations. So even this lineage-based claim couldn't possibly justify colonialism and ethnic cleansing because the ethnically cleansed Palestinian population shares the same ancestry. For example, this study found significant overlap in haplotypes between Palestinians and Israeli Jews. Jews of European origin were found to share ancestry with Palestinians, though were closer overall to Northern European populations. Jews of Middle Eastern origin were exactly the inverse, closer to Palestinians and more distant from Europeans, pretty much exactly as you'd expect. The authors concluded that their findings support the historical record, which points towards a common origin shared by most present-day Jews and Palestinians. According to historical records, part or perhaps the majority of the Muslim Arabs in this country descended from local inhabitants, mainly Christians and Jews, who had converted after the Islamic conquest in the 7th century AD. These local inhabitants, in turn, were descendants of the core population that had lived in the area for several centuries, some even since prehistorical times. On the other hand, the ancestors of the great majority of present-day Jews lived outside this region for almost 2 millennia. Thus, our findings are in good agreement with historical evidence and suggest genetic continuity in both populations, despite their long separation and the wide geographic dispersal of Jews. This is consistent with other genetic studies, such as this one, which found that most modern-day Jews, and particularly Middle Eastern ones, are not statistically different from modern-day non-Jewish Middle Eastern populations, and that they are most closely related to Palestinians and Syrians. The results additionally indicated that some Middle Eastern Jewish populations are even more closely related to Palestinians than they are to European Jews. A third study came to very similar conclusions when it looked more directly at the genetic relatedness between present-day Middle Eastern populations and actual direct genetic material from ancient human remains dated to around 1500 BC, which were found in Jordan, Palestine, and Lebanon. They concluded the genomes of present-day groups, geographically and historically linked to the Bronze Age Levant, including the great majority of present-day Jewish groups and Levantine Arabic-speaking groups, are consistent with having 50% or more of their ancestry from people related to groups who lived in the Bronze Age Levant. So even if we decide to entertain the ridiculous notion that lineage from people from thousands of years ago, real or imagined, could ever justify a present-day conquest and ethnic cleansing, the same exact justification would also apply to the Palestinians, the very population whose oppression it supposedly legitimizes. The people claiming that ancient ancestry makes that colonialism okay are victimizing people with that same ancient ancestry. This is clearly just incoherent drivel. No one rational actually believes it. Let's further examine for a second just how consistent these supposed indigenous rights advocates are. Are the people who try to claim that Israel is an indigenous land back initiative even actually in favor of such ideas in general? Do they apply their purported principles consistently and advocate for the idea that the USA, Australia, Canada, etc. should immediately be militarily destroyed and taken over by their indigenous peoples? Or do they mysteriously only seem to bring this up as a post hoc justification for the Israeli conquest of Palestine? Obviously, it's the latter, because they don't genuinely believe this. They believe the exact opposite, in fact. There's an absolutely overwhelming correlation between being pro-Israel and also pro-those countries and everything they stand for, and especially their unconditional support of Israel. There would be no Israel without the Western settler colonial states propping it up, so clearly its defenders would never support them being returned to their indigenous people. In fact, they'd very much side against it. Just more evidence of how disingenuous their arguments are. One more point that I want to cover here before finishing up is another argument that's often paired alongside this one, the claim that historical anti-Semitism, and in particular the Holocaust, also somehow legitimizes the Zionist colonization of Palestine. This is another fundamentally nonsensical argument, given that Palestinians had nothing to do with any of that. It makes about as much sense as it would to say that Aboriginal Australians have the right to invade Peru in retaliation for what Britain and Australia have done to them. A Jewish state somewhere in Europe, probably Germany, might have been justified as reparations for the Holocaust. But Zionists were already openly calling for and carrying out the colonization of Palestine and planning the expulsion of its non-Jewish population a whole lot earlier. They even found some of their strongest early allies in European anti-Semites who saw Jewish migration to Palestine as a way to get rid of their own Jewish populations. So use of the Holocaust as a justification for Zionist colonialism is clearly opportunistic, because this colonialism long predated it. That many people who had only recently endured the horrors of the Holocaust moved to Israel and became oppressors themselves so soon afterwards is tragic, but certainly does nothing to justify or absolve them of responsibility for joining up with the Zionist movement and helping to carry out its long-planned usurpation of Palestine and removal of the Palestinians that resulted in the foundation of today's ethnic supremacist, settler colonial state of Israel. In this case, we can again ask the question of whether this same justification is ever put forth, let alone accepted as valid, anywhere else. Is there another case where oppression is commonly used as a justification for the oppressed group moving elsewhere and oppressing the prior, totally unrelated inhabitants themselves? The answer is, of course, a resounding no. Refugees are people who move to places to live alongside those who are already there, not to get rid of them and form a new society on the ashes of theirs. There is an interesting earlier analogue to the Israeli case, the colonization of Liberia. In the early 19th century, white Americans who wanted to get rid of the growing population of black people freed from slavery there hatched the idea to send them to colonize somewhere in West Africa. After all, the logic went, that was where they were originally from a few generations ago, wasn't it? Much like in the Israeli case, their ancestry was used as a justification for colonization. Thousands of black Americans either signed up or were coerced into the scheme. These Americo-Liberians, as they came to be known, colonized the indigenous population, installed themselves as the country's rulers, and oppressed everyone else for their own benefit. A regime they maintained from 1822 until 1980. There's many of similarities shared between the story of Liberia and the oppression justifies Israel argument. Black Americans were clearly an oppressed group, most evident in the fact that slavery was still very much ongoing in the US when the colonization of Liberia began. Does that mean that it was cool and good for them to move there, colonize the land, and oppress its indigenous population for 158 years? The answer is pretty clearly no, and this is reflected in most remotely reasonable opinions on Liberia's founding today, just like the Zionist colonization of Palestine was and still is. It's also another excellent example of what indigenous actually means. In this case, despite their recent couple of 100-year-old West African ancestry, and the fact that some of them very well might even have had ancestors from Liberia specifically, the Americo-Liberians were not indigenous. Their victims were. One more small thing I want to mention really quick, because I've seen people actually make this argument before, and I couldn't find a better place in the video to cover it, is the fact that a community of around 10,000 Palestinian Jews lived in Palestine before Zionist colonization began. This is uncontroversially true, and also just irrelevant, because the presence of an ethnic or religious minority somewhere doesn't mean that every single other person in the world of that religion or ethnicity has the right to move there and carry out a settler colonial conquest and ethnic cleansing. That kind of goes without saying, right? It's also especially ridiculous for Israel supporters to mention because these pre-Zionist Palestinian Jews were actually some of the most ardent opponents of Zionism in the early days, as they were very religious and saw it as a blasphemy that was exploiting Judaism for political purposes. Okay, so let's recap what we've gone over here. All of these attempts to justify Zionist colonialism are esoteric nonsense. They don't hold up, even when their invalid premises are entertained. They rely on haphazard arguments that are little more than appeals to ancient ancestry and religion, which are not seriously accepted in other analogous situations, nor even in practice by the state whose existence and actions they supposedly serve to justify. These arguments are also completely invalid valid in the first place, because they rely on an intentionally misleading obfuscation of what it means to be indigenous. They want it to mean, we think we're related to people who lived here thousands of years ago, but it actually describes a relation to ongoing colonialism. These arguments are nothing more than cynical attempts to delegitimize the correct claims of Palestinians to indigenous status, made by pro-Israel propagandists who are losing control of the narrative in a world that is increasingly waking up to the reality of the Israeli colonization of Palestine. Thank you to all of my patrons and supporters, and especially my $25 plus ones: Jel Cribson, Shub, A Big Mean Cat, Mischief and Fins, Brosnan, Evan Carroll, William Tomlinson, Arthur Simak Jones, Jake Chowdhuin, Bantam, Robocomi, Exos, and my $10 plus patrons and supporters: Uminya Kresneti, Cab the Bird Ranger, Deep Sea J, JG, Michael Strauss, Ace Millard, Zanguseng, Melissa Gomez, Can't Care Less, XXXX, Average is Awesome, Justin Bailey 77, George Rosenbaum, Ugopnik, Adam Heitzman, Nabiru, Manuel Orantia, B, and Johnny Rocket. Thanks for watching, see you all next time.